Thank you so much. What an absolute pleasure. And just to add my heartfelt thanks for the last 3 days. It's been phenomenal. I'm already looking forward to watching everybody's presentation again and imagining a book. So I'll just launch right into session 9. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this session and really looking forward to the papers. So we will now move along to our third speaker. And the third speaker today is Umar Nizarudeen from the University of London, and the title of their paper is Being Too Early in India, Bildungsroman and Belatedness in Premature Birth. So over to you, Umar.
Thank you for inviting me to the conference. So my work is basically on bhakti, which is a dualistic mode of spirituality in India, where the deity is different from the devotee. So there is the permeability of the feminine body of the mother, which is separated from that of the child in bhakti, which is a dualistic philosophy, which is instantiated in figures like Krishna. The emergence of life into an ethnically divided social ecosystem in India brings with it a complex temporality as well as cultural specificity. This would later segue into psychology, infant observation, etc. The scholar Urvashi Agarwal, for instance, says that a girl child that is discriminated against reminds her of her own childhood and makes her identify with the woman she has become. So the strict laws that forbid determination of fetal gender through ultrasound scans or any other means and medical reports on fetus have to be accompanied by the insignia of competent authority that no sort of gender determination test has been carried out so as to prevent female infanticide. The emergence of gender as ethical lottery is commonplace because of this. The stringent laws which are in place to prevent female feticide due to traditional preference for male children in parts of India, excluding Kerala, Meghalaya, where the matrilineal traditions as well as progressive movements have acted as deterrent. The preterm birth of a female child can be linked to a belated Bildungsroman in the Indian context because the Indian sense of time is cyclical and the tradition of history in India does not follow a written paradigm but rather an orality. When a cyclical sense of time that consists of birth, death, rebirth, and the abyss of metempsychosis through infinite yonis or vaginas in different castes and forms as human and animal, the linear trajectory of the traditional Bildungsroman becomes less relevant. The preterm birth features in literature of feminine trauma. So Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak, in her essay Can the Subaltern Speak, speaks of a woman, 16 years old, named Bhuneshwari Bhaduri, who committed suicide because she didn't want to be captured. And she committed suicide while she was menstruating because she wanted to prevent the calumny that she was expecting a child out of wedlock. So, in order to prevent the cannot being spread that a young girl in India at that point of time before 1947 could commit suicide only owing to the shame of having born a child out of wedlock. She decided to take her life while she was menstruating. So the agency of the self, of the permeable feminine body, which is Advaitic, which is monistic, and which at the same time contains a cyclical temporality of trauma, which is inserted into the feminine Bildungsroman of writers, especially Arundhati Roy, an activist and writer from Kerala, who writes about the congealed subjectivity of dizygotic twins Esther and Rahel, in her Booker Prize winning novel, The God of Small Things, set in the backdrop of caste atrocities and the emergence of a nascent communist movement in Kerala, India. Ammu, the mother, had her birth pangs while the children were on a bus while they were on a bus in northeast of India, where her husband was working as an estate supervisor. The solicitousness and concern of the passengers in the bus is evoked by Roy that they exhibited the sympathy of the abjectly poor for the relatively well off. The children pride themselves on their near bus berth and rue the missed opportunity of a lifetime of free bus rides. They were nearly born on a bus, Esther and Rahel. The car in which Baba, their father, was taking Ammu, their mother, to hospital in Shillong, Meghalaya, to have them, broke down on the winding tea estate road in Assam. They abandoned the car and flagged down a crowded state transport bus with the clear compassion of the very poor for the comparatively well off, or perhaps only because they saw how hugely pregnant Amu was. Seated passengers made room for the couple, and for the rest of the journey, Esther and Rahel's father had to hold the mother's stomach with them in it to prevent it from wobbling. That was before they were divorced and Amu came back to live in Kerala. According to Esther, if they had been born on the bus, they would have got free bus rides for the rest of their lives. It wasn't clear where he had got this information from or how he knew these things, but for years the twins harbored a faint resentment against their parents for having diddled them out of a lifetime of free bus rides. They also believed that if they were killed on a zebra crossing, the government would pay for the funerals. The novel revolves around the twins and the mother Amu, who is divorced and has come to stay in their homestead, where she has no rights and her brother Chaku dominates the household. Amu has an affair with a childhood friend, a so called lower caste person called Veluta, which, when discovered by her Syrian Christian family, upper caste, is not tolerated. Only the twins survive to retell the story in multiple registers. The novel relates the coalesced selves, the Advaitic nature of the twins Rahel and Esther, who evoke their selves collectively as I and individually as we in a confusion of pronouns. Rahel had come to see her brother Esther. There were two egg twins. Dizygotic, doctors call them, born from separate but simultaneously fertilized eggs. Esteban was the older by 18 minutes. They never did look much like each other, Esther and Rahel, and even when they were thin armed children, flat chested, worm ridden, and Elvis Presley puffed, there was none of the usual who is who and which is which from our smiling relatives or the Syrian Orthodox bishops who frequently visited the Imanam house for donations. The confusion lay in a deeper, more secret place. In those early amorphous years when memory had only just begun, when life was full of beginnings and no ends, and everything was forever, Esteban and Rahel thought of themselves together as me and separately, individually as we or us, as though they were a rare breed of Siamese twins, physically separate but with joint identities. Rahel has a memory of waking up one night giggling at Esther's funny dream. She has other memories too that she has no right to have. She remembers what the orange drink, lemon drink man did to Esther in Ablestokis. So these are only the small things. Anyway, now she thinks of Esther and Rahel as them because separately the two of them are no longer what they were or ever thought they would be, ever. And Ammu, because she has an affair with Velita, is forced to get rid of Esther, the boy, and this is compared to Mose and the Pharaoh story, and also Karna, a hero in the legend Mahabharata, who is abandoned after childbirth by his mother Kunti because she had conceived Karna with the son before she was married, and fearing calumny, like Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri, she floats the child on the Ganges. And later, the child would be picked up by a charioteer and bring the child as his own. And later, there would be a war called the Kurukshetra and the Bhagavad Gita, where Karna would fight his brothers. And so essentially the story also is mirrored in God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, where Esther is abandoned by his mother Amu, and the same story is also presented as a Kathakali, an Indic performance dance form from Kerala. So the Advaitic monastic current of the Vedic corpus of India can be seen to have best out the twin identity crisis with a stamp of approval for the Syrian Christian community, which belongs to the Eastern Church that has withstood the early modern incursions and evangelical missions of colonial nature. Advaita, as a major monastic current that uprooted Buddhism in India, was propounded by Shankaracharya from Kerala. The thou art that principle of Advaitic monism as well as Sufism have informed the anti-caste movement in Kerala, spearheaded by various spiritual leaders like Sri Narayana Guru. The multi-genesis ideology of caste is pitted against Advaita, and there is a monogenesis ideology which has become what is called the Kerala Enlightenment, Kerala modernity, and one of the earliest democratically elected communist governments. So, the idea of Krishna, the infant Krishna, who has a devotee in Puntanam Nambudiri, who himself had a child, and during the naming ceremony, Chorunu ceremony of the child, various people come to visit the family, and all of them are wearing an upper clothes on their torsos, a kind of towel. And all of them, after entering the house, remove the towel from their torsos and unknowingly, accidentally place these towels on top of the crib where the baby is sleeping. And as a result, the baby suffocates and dies. And so Punthanam, who is a devotee of Krishna, he writes the poem, when the infant Krishna is dancing in your mind, what need do I have for other babies of my own? So this is also uncannily similar to the Freudian metaphor of the father whose son visits in a dream visitation and says, Vater, kannst du sie das ich verbrennen? So the insanity among Syrian Christians is the praise they paid for inbreeding, according to the character Chaco. So Roy says that equally it could be argued that it all began thousands of years ago, long before the Marxists came, before the British took Malabar, before the Dutch ascendancy, before Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut, before the Zamorin's conquest of Calicut, before three purple-robed Syrian bishops murdered by the Portuguese were found floating in the sea with coiled sea serpents riding on their chests and oysters knotted in their tangled beards. It could be argued that it began long before, in an amniotic metaphor, Christianity arrived in a boat and seeped into Kerala like bleeding tea from a tea bag. That it really began in the days when the love laws were made, the laws that laid down who should be loved and how much. So the idea of the Intik Vasudeva Kudumbakam, the world as a family that accepts various ethnicities and races as its own, is foregrounded by Roy, for whom the circle of violence and counter violence can potentially be stemmed by identifying with this maternal Cora of census communists called the Cora by Julia Kristeva, the prehistoric, non archived tradition of existence and acceptance of birth, rebirth, and the eternal reiteration of life in a trajectory towards moksha, an elusive soteriology that is sought ab ovo. So, this is why Beno, etc., have called Roy's narrative atemporal and negative and dark. Thus, the past is always in the present, and the present is always shaping the future. This fluid backwards and forwards movement of the chronological, of the Cora, of the cyclical Cora temporal sequences are no longer anchored in a static time frame, and the temporal signifiers float loosely on a stream of sliding signifiers as the reader gropes her way through the narrative's cyclical labyrinthine structure rather than a linear progression. So, following Gil and Ijjar, motherhood not solely as reproduction of the species and family, but of an entire series of social functions, which could also include caste, which is the major Advaitic current which divides society into four classes based on the origin of different yogis, of different births, the Brahmin, the Kshatriya, the Shudra, and the Vaishya, which are essentially based on vocations but became congealed and lapidary later based on birth, where a priest would be a Brahmin, and a fighter would be a Kshatriya, and a merchant would be a Vaishya, and a peasant would be Shudra. So, Roy, a vehement critique of the caste atrocities, gave this speech where she calls for a broader identification with the egalitarian traditions of Vasudeva Kutumbaka, the world as the family of Krishna. Is it really possible for people who suffered so cruelly, more cruelly perhaps than any other people, to understand the vulnerability and yearning of those whom they have displaced? Does extreme suffering always kindle cruelty? What hope does this leave the human race with? What will happen to a people in the event of a victory? When a nation without a state eventually proclaims a state, what kind of state will it be? What horrors will be perpetrated under its flag? Is it a separate state that we should be fighting for, or the rights to life, of liberty and dignity for everyone, regardless of their caste, ethnicity, religion, or nation? So for newborns, it's I conclude here, it's an unbalanced fight for life. We have to put 4 or 5 babies in one incubator. Most of them don't survive, says Dr. Al Shayer at the Al Hilal Maternity Hospital. Thank you.
Thank you, Umar. That was a staggering